Hi, welcome everyone. It's great to see you all here in the atrium of the Gropiusbau. My name is Magnus Elias Rosengarten. I'm co-curator of AMA 4 Days on Caring, Repairing and Healing. And before I will hand over to Prem and his panel, I have a couple of short housekeeping announcements. You will have to wear your mask during the panel. This is very important. And at the end, please leave through the south entrance of the atrium. I'm very excited to hand over to you, Prem. This is a very good question. Behind, you know, is that the right or the left side? Right side. Left side from me, right side from you. Sorry, I'm very bad with directions, but this is exactly the exit, yeah. We've already had 2 amazing days of AMA with theoretical introductions to the term care by Ilyana Fokianaki. Last night we had a panel on the COVID-19 pandemic in German and sort of like the discrepancies and social inequalities it has shown within the German context. Today, or now, we will focus on this institution here, the museum and its challenges. Healing the Museum is what it's called, and I'm handing over to you, Prem, and your panelists. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, is this on?
Sorry, can you turn it up?
Is this on now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Magnus. Thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you to Christian and Christina and everybody who has helped put this together on the technical side, and to the entire Gropiusbau for welcoming us here. Before we begin, those of you who might have ever been to an event online or in person with me might understand that I tend to believe in starting with some grounding. So I'll encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to stand up, and I'll invite you to do a short practice with me that I learned from Resmaa Menakem, who is a Minneapolis-based trauma specialist and therapist. It's a way to stimulate the vagal nerve, and he encourages it in particular for what he calls bodies of culture when they enter into an unfamiliar space. But I think that it's actually equally applicable to all of us when we enter into this new context. So I'll invite you to simply let yourself land, feel your feet on the ground, and allow your gaze to fall in front of you. And slowly, turn and look over your left shoulder. Over your left shoulder. And then slowly come back to center. And again, let your gaze fall directly in front of you. And with the slow motion, you can simply turn your head upwards and then downwards and back to center. And now, you can simply turn and look over your right shoulder, pivoting with your hips and shoulders. And then allow yourself to return to center. Okay, thank you, everyone. So, this panel is called Healing the Museum, ? And I think the question mark is important because the museum has, for everybody, I think, different meanings. For some people here, the museum may be a place of respite, a refuge into the quiet meditation of art and human culture. But for others, the museum itself might represent a kind of original sin. The museum might be an institution that is founded on colonial exploitation and the desire to forcibly educate others. So one might ask in this perspective, how might a cancer or a disease itself be healed? We have with us today 3 fantastic panelists, and I'm extremely thrilled and excited to be able to create the container or help to co-create a container for the discussions that will emerge. Each of them have a very different perspective, and I hope out of their perspectives and the combined perspectives of all of you in the room, we might come to some new understandings and new thinking around the museum and healing. So let me introduce them, starting from the far end with Nadia Ofuate Alazard. She is an African-German editor, curator, and activist. She's co-CEO and artistic director of Each One, Teach One, and curates interventions for the project Dekoloniale Memory Culture in the city of Berlin. And she herself has been leading a workshop over the last couple of days, so we're very lucky to have her take her time and join us here for this conversation. Thank you, Nadia. And then yeah. And here, as our second panelist, we have Dirk Sorge. He is an artist and cultural educator based in Berlin and Leipzig. His work focuses on accessibility, standardization, technology, and automatisms. He is a founding member of Berlinclusion, a network that promotes the active participation of people with disabilities in art and culture. So let's have a round of applause for Dirk. And last but not least, we have Grace Diritu, who is a British Kenyan artist using shamanism and the practices of sharing and healing to break down established boundaries and dualisms. From 2020 to 2021, Grace established the Year of Black Healing, an artistic response to politicians' attempts to co-opt Black culture. And her work will be presented in a group show on caring, repairing, and healing at the Agropius Bau in 2022, which I believe is also the implicit reason for all of us to come together for these several days as a way to think together about this project. So let's have a round of applause for Grace. Just a word to the format. We will follow each of the panelists in the order as I introduce them. We'll briefly introduce their work and thinking on this topic, and then we'll open it up into a different kind of discussion amongst you all in the audience and a way for us to ask questions and dive deeper. So we'll start with Nadia then. Thank you very much, and we're very excited to hear what will unfold today.
Thank you, Prem. Hello, everybody. Let's do a mic check. I think the mic is on now. So thank you. It's an honor, Grace, Dirk, Prem, to engage in this conversation. Yeah, what am I bringing to you today? Prem already described the various sites that I'm sort of operating in. I think for this context, for this conversation, the work we are doing in the framework of Dekoloniale memory culture in the city is maybe most appropriate. I must say that I'm maybe a skeptic concerning the transformation and the possibilities of healing of Western-type museums, but we are going to engage in that later in this conversation. Dekoloniale memory culture in the city is a pilot project. Started in 2020. It's a 5-year project. And we have 4 sections, four project sections. The first one is called Histories, Geschichten, and that is basically represented through a southern world map that sort of looks at the entanglements of Berlin with the rest of the world. Obviously the focus is colonial history, making that visible, but particularly also making the histories of resistance and, possible transformations visible. And this digital world map continues to grow over the 4 years with a lot of content. We're making visible all the things we are doing, but also there's a lot of research, especially also by authors from the global south, particularly from former German colonies. So if you have a look at dekoloniale.de, you can see how this map continues to grow. So that's histories. The second part is representations, and that is mostly around conceptualizing and producing different type of exhibits. In conjunction with district museums in Berlin, we just opened our first exhibit in mid-October called Looking Back. That's at the Bezirksmuseum Treptow. So please, if you haven't been there, you should. And that one deals with the human zoos that were shown in Berlin in the context of the first Gewerbeausstellung. And there was a human zoo in 1896. But the participants, 106 individuals from the former German colonies, sort of gazed back, as an act of resistance. The third is developments. That's our museum work, and that's something that we are building currently. So we are going to engage in sort of like conversations as we are doing today, engaging with museums, and that's not my responsibility, that's another team. And that is something that we are, in the process of building up. That's consulting, looking at collections, devising ways of possibly healing or transforming the museums. And then the fourth part, for which I'm responsible, is interventions, and that those are the discursive and performative aspects of Dekoloniale, so festivals, framing programs, and also a series of think tanks called Revisions. And I brought you some excerpts from one of our last think tanks, and that one dealt with African memory cultures and the new museums. Let's have a look. And then part of that is in French, so I will try to sort of sum it up for those of you that are not maybe fluent in French. So please film up.
My views about these things. And here I would one day like to talk to Frau Grütters, your Minister for Culture, Monika Grütters. I one day like to talk to her. My ideas basically spring from two Christian principles. She talks often about Christianity as the German person. My ideas really revolve around just two simple Christian principles. Incidentally, I'm no longer a Christian, but I learned that much when I was following this. One is, thou shalt not steal. Two, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I've written these things in some of my articles, and I know Europeans don't like people preaching to them, but they've been preaching to Africans for the last 10 years. So I decided I could also do a bit of preaching without any. So when you take those principles seriously, there's no justification for the British invading Benin and taking so many things out, or invading Kumasi and collecting things out. Most of the arguments were completely silly, that the Africans cannot look after their artifacts. Of course, the Africans cannot look after their artifacts if the British Army comes and kills the people and takes the things away. I mean, what are we to do? And also ideas, foolish ideas that we didn't have qualified people to look after them. I mean, it's a bit like this situation where they are all talking about building new museums and all that. It's nice to have a new, good, modern museum, but this is not related to the question of ownership. My example, which I always give, is like somebody stealing my Mercedes. When I ask him to return my Mercedes, he says, I will only return it when you build a good garage. a good garage, which I will determine according to my standards, not your silly little things here and there. And this is what they are doing with the museums. They're telling the Nigerians and the rest of Africans that, okay, we may bring some of these things back, but you people have to get a good museum up to modern standards. I have nothing against museums with modern standards, but that's beside the point. Anyway, so I realized that they had not a single valid argument.
Alors, je n'ai pas encore créé d'espace, justement, je suis mandaté pour animer la réflexion autour de ce que serait ce type d'espace. Donc, il y a un certain nombre d'ambiguïtés, même de complexités que je dois traiter dans ce cas. C'est-à-dire que la plupart des gens qui sont à l'œuvre pour la restitution des objets pensent que les objets ne devraient pas revenir dans des configurations qui sont celles dans lesquelles elles sont préservées aujourd'hui. Je veux dire, pour aller très vite, on imagine qu'on ne devrait pas créer des musées en Afrique sur le modèle des musées occidentaux, et que l'Afrique pourrait imaginer d'autres façons d'accueil, de monstration de ces objets-là. Donc c'est très complexe parce qu'il y a des envies de faire rentrer les objets pour les réinscrire dans des circuits cultuels, c'est-à-dire plutôt des objets à charger de nouveau et qui seraient l'objet qui rentrerait dans des logiques de déconstruction. Il y a d'autres qui pensent qu'il faut donner des garanties pour que les objets soient restitués mais préservés avec les mêmes exigences que quand ils étaient en Occident et que ce serait le seul moyen de convaincre les gens de les restituer. Donc moi, je dois créer donc un espace qui doit jouer avec cette complexité-là, qui doit être à la fois un lieu qui donne toutes les garanties de préservation des objets, mais qui ne soit pas un lieu musée un peu, entre guillemets, inerte sur le modèle des musées occidentaux. Donc c'est la réflexion que je porte et qui peut nourrir un peu le débat, je crois, sur la restitution. Donc le type de lieu n'est pas encore arrêté. C'est le process dans lequel, en tant que designer, en tant qu'architecte, en tant qu'anthropologue, nous sommes en ce moment. Donc le projet est porté ici localement par l'Union togolaise des cultes traditionnels, mais c'est un projet en partenariat avec donc Mathilde, qui est en Allemagne, qui est professeure à UDK. Et ils sont en train en ce moment de lever justement ou de chercher à rassembler le budget pour rendre possible ce projet.
So the first speaker was Dr. Kwame Opoku. He's an activist, has been for a long time, around issues of restitution, particularly focusing on the restitution of the Benin bronze. Also to just show that these discourses have a history. It's not just, you know, over the past recent years, but they have deep history. And especially in the 60s, for example, there were discourses around that already which have sort of been buried. And the way I work is I like to work in intergenerational formats also to sort of show the deep histories and also to show on whose shoulders we are standing or, you know, working, performing today. The second statement is by Sename Agbojinu. He is an architect and anthropologist from Togo. You know, Togo was one of the former German colonies, and those two statements were embedded in a 2-hour conversation. You can watch that on decoloniale.de in the archive. That was our second think tank this year around questions of restitution, African memory cultures, and ideas about the new museum. And so we had video inputs from civil society representatives from the former German colonies. This was the one from Togo, and the interesting thing why I chose it is that there is a project in the making, the Maison Guébé, which is going to be built. Plans are to build a cultural center and a new museum in Anejo, on the coast in Togo, so east of Lomé, the capital, and thinking up a new museum. So once objects are going to be restituted, sacred objects, the idea is to make them available for research and make them available to the public, but also particularly make them available to the association of traditional religious practitioners in that region, so trying to find a new way of dealing with these objects. And that is what Sename was also sort of communicating, talking about these thought processes of how to think up a new type of museum that does not sort of stagnate in the way that museums in the West perform. So I think it sums it up in a nutshell. Let me just think, do I need to say something else? Oh yes, and if you're interested in that project, in 22, Decoloniale will really feature that project. I'm on the board meanwhile myself, and I'm really excited about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadia. Fantastic. What a great way to start out the conversation, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these topics in the discussion. So as our second speaker, let's move to Dirk Sorge. Dirk, you have the word.
Ich hoffe, ich bin gut zu hören. Sorry, I have to switch to English. Yeah, sorry. No worries. So like Prem already told you, so I'm a part of Berlin Inclusion. So we are a small organization which is consulting cultural institutions when they want to become more inclusive or more accessible. So we have also consulted Gropiusbau and many other big institutions in Berlin. And maybe just as a brief insight, I would say I'm skeptical if museums can be healed. But even more, I'm skeptical about the concept of healing altogether because, sorry, that wasn't me, because I'm coming from a disabled perspective, so I'm a disabled artist, and I'm very skeptical, as many other disabled people, I'm skeptical about the concept of healing and also about the concept of caring, which is also one big term for this 4-day event. And maybe I won't go into too much detail, but maybe I will show you a video first. Maybe that will make it more clear why I'm so skeptical. This video that I will show, I will only show 5 minutes. It's an 11-minute video. It's called Museum of Blinding Arts, or on German Museum der blendenden Künste. And I did this video last year for a museum in Leipzig, Museum der bildenden Künste, so it's a word play with the word bild, which means image, and blind, and blinding, blind. So and it's a 5-minute excerpt that I will show, and maybe then afterwards I can talk a little bit more about this video piece. So maybe film up.
Mit beiden Händen fest. Der andere hat einen Stock geschultert.
Sorry, we have to start from the beginning.
In der Bibelgeschichte wird der Gelähmte jeden Tag zum Betteln vor den Tempel getragen. Viele Menschen glauben, Blindheit ist nichts anderes als reine Dunkelheit. Sie denken, wenn es dunkel ist, sieht man ja nichts, also sehen blinde Menschen einfach schwarz. Blindgeborene sehen aber nicht schwarz, sie sehen nichts. Für Sehende ist das schwer zu verstehen, denn sie können sich das bildlich nicht vorstellen. Besonders für bildende KünstlerInnen, ist Blindheit als Thema eine große Herausforderung, denn das Nichts kann im Bild nicht dargestellt werden. Blindheit entsteht nicht nur durch fehlendes Licht. Auch wenn es zu viel Licht gibt, sieht man nichts. Man wird geblendet. Der Musiker Johann Sebastian Bach wurde im Alter von 65 Jahren hochgradig sehbehindert. Er konnte nicht mehr lesen und schreiben, auch keine Noten. Als Komponist war das praktisch das Ende seiner Karriere. Das war im Jahr 1750. Bach hatte einen grauen Star, also eine Trübung der Linse im Auge. Diese Krankheit ist heute durch eine unkomplizierte Operation heilbar. Dabei wird die natürliche Linse entfernt und durch eine Linse aus Kunststoff ersetzt. Mehr als 500.000 solcher Operationen werden in Deutschland jedes Jahr durchgeführt. Zur Lebzeit von Bach war so ein Eingriff aber nicht in dieser Form möglich. Die Operationen und Behandlungsmethoden waren abenteuerlich und nur wenige Ärzte konnten oder wollten sie durchführen. Einer dieser Ärzte war Dr. John Taylor. Taylor war bekannt für schwierige Augenoperationen und reiste durch verschiedene Länder in ganz Europa, um teils berühmten Leuten den grauen Star zu stechen. Seine Kutsche war mit vielen Bildern von Augen bemalt. Die Operationen waren inszeniert wie feierliche Rituale oder Performances. Diese schwarz-weiße Druckgrafik, ein Kupferstich, zeigt ihn in eleganter Kleidung des 18. Jahrhunderts und langem lockigem Haar. Das längliche Gesicht schaut uns offen und selbstbewusst an. Seine linke Hand ist leicht geöffnet und schulterhoch angehoben. Die rechte Hand ist auf eine hüfthohe Brüstung gestützt, die das Bild am unteren Rand abschließt. Dr. Taylor kam auch nach Leipzig und operierte Johann Sebastian Bach dort im Jahr 1750. Die erste Operation im März war nicht erfolgreich, aber nach der zweiten im Juli konnte Bach wieder sehen. John Taylor war zwar Mediziner, er stand aber auch in einer langen Tradition, die aus einem religiösen christlichen Kontext stammt, nämlich die Heilung der Kranken als Spektakel oder Event. In der Bibel gibt es eine ganze Reihe von Erzählungen über die Heilung von blinden, gelähmten und tauben Menschen. Ein Beispiel ist ein Kapitel in der Apostelgeschichte, in dem Petrus und Johannes zu einem Tempel in Jerusalem kommen. Sie treffen dort einen Gelähmten. Dieser Kupferstich von Nicolas Dourigny zeigt die Szene vor dem Tempel. Zwischen prunkvoll verzierten Säulenreihen steht ungefähr 1 Dutzend Menschen mit antiker Kleidung. Einige davon haben Bärte. Im Vordergrund sitzt ein Mann auf dem Boden und schaut 2 Männer an, die direkt vor ihm stehen. Rechts von ihm, durch eine Säule getrennt, sind 2 nackte Jungen. Der eine hält das Gewand eines Mannes ausgebreitet mit beiden Händen fest. Der andere hat einen Stock geschultert, an dem 2 Tauben hängen. In der Bibelgeschichte wird der Gelähmte jeden Tag zum Betteln vor den Tempel getragen. Er bittet auch Petrus und Johannes um Almosen, aber bekommt stattdessen eine Wunderheilung durch Petrus. Und er ergriff ihn bei der rechten Hand und richtete ihn auf. Sogleich wurden seine Füße und Knöchel fest. Er sprang auf, konnte stehen und gehen und ging mit ihnen in den Tempel, lief und sprang umher und lobte Gott. Der Mensch mit Gehbehinderung wird hier benutzt, um den anderen Menschen im Tempel ein Wunder zu zeigen. Das Wunder soll sie davon überzeugen, dass Jesus Christus allmächtig ist und daher der Sohn Gottes. In der Bibel wird das medizinische Modell von Behinderung vertreten. Anstatt die Gesellschaft an die Bedürfnisse von Menschen mit Behinderung anzupassen, werden diese geheilt. So sollen sie normal werden, damit sie nicht mehr stören. In der Bibel werden aber nicht nur Wunderheilungen für bedürftige Kranke und Menschen mit Behinderung durchgeführt.
So I will continue in this video. You can watch this video on my website if you want later. I can give you a short or small spoiler. So I will talk about how disability is used as a punishment in many stories of the Bible. And maybe to to give you a spoiler, what happened to Bach, so Johann Sebastian Bach, the famous musician, after the second surgery by John Taylor, Bach died, like many other patients of Dr. John Taylor. So this doctor, he was traveling around Europe and he was leaving a trace of dead people or blind people. So his surgery was a fake. He was promising healing, but he was blinding people totally or even killing them. And he knew that, and he was like running away from from this crime scene, so to say. And I guess the problem with a healing concept is that one person has a more powerful position in the hierarchy and is healing the other person, and the one person is, or maybe the whole system of this person is deciding what is normal, what is healthy, and what is like the standard how you should be. And if one person is ill or sick or disabled, and this person needs to be adjusted to fit into this norm. And I am criticizing this concept, and of course also this concept of caring, that like the non-disabled people have to care for the poor disabled people, which was displayed in this image. So this paralyzed person who couldn't walk, he was carried into the temple and just put on the ground for begging. And I think if you want, you could trace a long history throughout the Western iconography, like how people are displayed, people with disabilities are displayed on paintings or also in sculptures. And disability is always seen as something that needs to be healed instead of adjusting the environment or instead of adjusting like the surrounding. And in the case of Bach, a few years after Bach died, there was an invention that made for blind musicians possible to read notes. So there is a way for blind musicians to read notes and to write notes. And maybe that's a better way, instead of healing the person, giving them the right tools to work and like inventing new accessible methods. And by this, you don't have to heal anyone anymore, but you can stay how you are, and you get the tools that you need. And I'm not sure how you can transfer this idea to the museum, but maybe that only gives you a small idea why the concept of healing alone should not be used in a naive way, at least. I mean, I guess maybe I'm very like coming from a Western perspective, so healing and caring is very, very negatively connotated for me, but maybe from other perspective it can be used in a different way, and I'm very curious about finding out how there could be a more positive way of healing and caring. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Dirk. That gives us definitely some food for thought and further discussion to think about tools as we continue. So let's continue now to our third panelist, Grace Diritu. Grace.
Okay, thank you for coming today, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I guess I'm the only maybe optimistic person on the panel about this subject. I think that's to do with my background. I can briefly tell you a little bit about that. So my family is from Kenya, and I grew up there in rural Kenya, but also in England in a working class neighborhood. My mother, she was a single mother with 3 children, and she was a nurse and then also an activist. And when I was about 10, she went to study Truth and Reconciliation Studies. So this idea of healing has always been in our life and always connected to politics. Also, I've always had a very strong esoteric practice connected to do with animism, and later on in life, as an adult, I've trained in different aspects of shamanism and meditation. And so today I'd like to do something I'm calling the Museum of the Future. This is a guided meditation. So we'll do that first, and then I'll give you an example of how I've practically used my ideas in my practice as an artist. And so, just to contextualize the meditation, I'm just going to read you a quote. So, on any given day that you visit the ancient Egyptian galleries at the British Museum in London, you may not realize that the objects on display are unhappy. They no longer feel special because of the cultural and energetic rape that has been enacted on them through being exposed to the endless photography of tourists and feel objectified in the true sense of the word. These objects were never meant to be seen by a single ray of sunlight, never mind millions of keen museum goers. Hence, they feel they've been robbed of their agency and such have no rights. They want to be free. How have I come to this conclusion? By accessing different states of mind and consciousness over the last many years. This quote is taken from my essay, Ways of Seeing, a new museum story for planet Earth, which was recently republished on the Gropius Bau journal online, so you can read it there. So today's performance is also inspired by my own research and also the ecological activist Joanna Macy work from the 1960s and London activist group BP or Not to BP and their famous slogan, stolen land, stolen culture, stolen climate, which connects environmental justice to ethnographic collections and also corporate sponsorship of museums by corporations and oil companies. So for the Museum of the Future, maybe it's nice if you sit comfortably. And if everybody can close their eyes. So I'd like you to focus on the area just below the nostrils and above the upper lip. Just close your eyes and focus on the area just below the nostrils and above the upper lip. Do not change your breath. Just let it be natural. And as you begin to notice your breath going in and going out, you may notice that it is long or it is short. If it is long, let it be long. And if the breath is short, let it be short. Do not change it. We're going to sit in silence for a few moments and connect with our breath, going in and going out. And as we keep connecting with our breath, going in and going out, I want you to think for a moment about your youngest living descendant. Maybe your child, or your nephew, or a niece, or someone not directly in your lineage, but a child that feels like the future to you. Imagine the life of this child, their present, and imagine them growing into an adult and having a child of their own. Now picture this child coming into our world a few generations into the future. And as we allow this child, this baby, to grow up and become an adult, it will have its own child. And imagine that child's colour of its eyes, the shape of its chin, the colour of its hair. What does that child's child look like? We see this child taking its first steps. We see it's maturing from infancy to early childhood. We see it as it enters the community and the network of family and friends. But what kind of future can we hope for this child's child? Now consider how dangerous the world is in which this child lives. This child might die of cancer caused by the poisoning of the air they breathe or the food they eat. This child might die in some senseless war, another pandemic, or a refugee crisis triggered by an ecological disaster. Now, there's another thing to see in this child's face. Allow your awareness to open to the very real possibility that this child may play a divisive role in the healing of the world and the building of community. And that this child is in the right place at the right moment with the right gifts. Allow that possibility to enter your mind. And as you keep your eyes closed, try to focus on what it would feel like to work alongside this child for the healing of the earth, which include museums, to prevent violence, warfare, economic crisis, and future pandemics. What would it feel like? What would it feel like to have this child thank you for the work you're doing in your lifetime to ensure the world's continuance? Listen to the child for a few moments. And as we connect with our breath, as it goes in and it goes out, imagine that this child now lives in a world that is free of the imminent threat of economic crisis, that poverty has been eradicated, water is abundant, clean oceans are diverse and vital. And as we allow this future child to rest in your heart, we also must think and envision how a healthy environment and a healed world in which museums play an active role can come into being. I'd like you to open your eyes and come back into the room. So I'd finally just like to finish this with some practical steps for healing the museum and creating the museum of the future. So if an organisation wants to positively influence the social field around them, they must practice a lack of self-interest. This is something that in Buddhism is a really important way of thinking to cultivate, an idea of self-interest, a lack of self-interest. And so with organisations, we all know this is happening when three things begin to occur spontaneously. Number one, the emergence of spontaneous positive states. Collectors and corporations giving money to institutions without expecting anything in return. So no more corruption. Two, the influence of mass behaviour, listening empathically to the needs of colleagues, especially those with less power. No more toxic workplace. Three, the accumulation of positive efforts that affect the unfolding of the long-term mission. For example, committing to change the ecological footprint of the arts organisation, especially working with source and Indigenous communities from which the objects were taken from in the first place. These three things together will allow institutions to change their course of history, so that positive states eclipse a self-interest and institutions starts to think of the greater good naturally. This is the museum of the future. So I'd like to give an example of my own practice of where I've been working on this. So in 2012, I started a body of work called Healing the Museum. And I did this because I was very frustrated that every time I would go to museums, I would feel very disconnected with the shows that were going on. I came up with this feeling that I felt like museums were dying because they were so disconnected politically and energetically. And so the only way to kind of begin to heal museums was to bring new audiences, but also to bring new energies into museums. So the idea of introducing non-rational energies through things like shamanism and meditation back into the museum to reactivate those spaces and the objects within the spaces became important to me. And so I started doing shamanic performances in museums with staff from museums, but also the general public, usually the public who thought of themselves as quite rational beings. And so for an example of this, I'll tell you about one of those performances. So in 2018, I was in Belgium. And so this was just after the bombing in the airport. The terrorist bombing had happened. And also, this was just at the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis. And I did a project called A Meal for My Ancestors. And so in the project, the idea was to try to think about healing trauma through food, shamanism, meditation, and art. And so for 4 months, I worked with 2 sets of people. So these 2 sets of people were staff members from agencies like NATO, the UN, and the EU Parliament, and also a group of activists, refugees, and migrants. So I kept the 2 sets of people separate for 4 months, and I gave free meditation classes to the refugees and migrants. And this was about being able to calm the mind, because what I understood is that actually most people in that category of living, they felt it was in a precarious way of living. So physically, there was a lot of stress around food, around money, in a daily, everyday situation. So the benefit of calming the mind was more important. And then the second group of people, the staff at these agencies, obviously they have a very physical, comfortable life, they get well paid. But their issue is the fact that they have no creative ability in terms of making decisions. Their jobs are about ticking boxes and about bureaucracy. So the idea of using creative visualization exercises to help them to come up with different ways of thinking about doing their job became important. So for 4 months, I worked with these 2 sets of people. And then after 4 months, I brought them together to meet for the first time. And this was important because normally these groups of people never meet unless there's a problem, like a political crisis. So it was important for them to meet for another reason. And so in the performance, what happened, everybody lay on the floor, and it didn't really matter if you were like a director or an intern or you're a refugee or you know, in the project we had people from many different jobs. I had someone from the terrorist department. I had a high court judge from Lille who does a lot of cases to do with difficult asylum cases. He was part of the project. And I had people from the Foreign Office. And so together are all on the floor. So all the power structures began to change in that moment. And so what happened is that most people on their shamanic journey saw things to do with climate change, you know, and especially around climate refugees. And so afterwards, one of the people from the Foreign Office, she had seen something really quite horrific and decided that she had to do something about it. And the thing that she decided to do was that she decided to write a paper and also start a think tank to think about changing the law. So at the moment, at that time, the law was that if you came to Europe and you were a refugee and you came for a war or you came for genocide, you could claim asylum. But if you came as a climate refugee for climate reasons, you can't. So she wanted to start this think tank to be able to change this law in the parliament and within the UN. And for me, this really made me understand that how contemporary art, like something so non-rational or something so esoteric as shamanism or performative actions or performance, could actually end up in something quite practical, like a think tank and a paper. And so I just wanted to give that example of how, you know, my ideas of healing the museum is that you have to use not only the rational part of your mind, you know, the left brain, but you should also be able to tap into the right brain and come up with new ways of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace, for taking us on that journey and for that example. And thank you to Diak and Nadia for their presentations as well. Now, part of this event is also to bring different perspectives together. And so rather than going into a traditional, typical Q&A right now, I'd like to encourage us to also take a little journey. So if you'd like, you can feel free to stand up and feel free to turn yourself around. Look around at the people who are next to you, who are behind you, those you may not know in the room. And as you look around the room, I'd like you to make eye contact with somebody whom you do not already know. Make eye contact with a person who is a new person for you. Somebody you're encountering for the first time, as we are here on this panel. And once you make eye contact with that person, move towards them if it feels comfortable. Reorient yourself and come together with the person whom you have chosen and who ostensibly has chosen you. Has everybody found somebody? Please look around and feel free to move. Feel free to move from where you are. And so now we have here this atrium, this wonderful open space where you can rearrange yourself, you can move, you can walk, you can talk. And I'd like to encourage you now to take the length of a song that will play now, to talk with the person who is next to you, to find out who they are, to ask them how they feel about the question of healing the museum and what they've just experienced, and together to see what resonated, what questions you have, and how you would like to continue this discussion when we come back. So feel free to move and walk and use this entire space as we listen to a song by Kokoroko. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So, the song is now done, and please, I welcome you to come and find a seat again, either where you originally were or a new seat. So, time is, unfortunately, in the context that we live in, time is always scarce. Time is never a thing to be luxuriated in and enjoyed in large pieces. But I hope that the conversations you've started with the people who are new, whom you met, may continue after this. We have a whole day and a half still of programming. But for now, we've rejoined. We had a chance to have a conversation. I'd like to invite any questions or comments or resonances from people in the audience to the topics that have been discussed or to the specific speakers. Yes. Can somebody bring a mic?
Hello. Can you hear me?
You can take your mask off too.
Oh, thank you. Maybe I'll formulate a question as I speak. Just a topic that that we were discussing was about language. So perhaps each of you could speak about how language is connected to the work you're doing. Can you not hear me?
Can you turn it up a little bit? Thank you. Language, I heard how language is connected to the work that they're doing.
Yes. And choices about language and the performance of language in different spaces.
Thank you. Did you hear the question okay, Nadia and Dirk? Yeah, and how you choose the language in the spaces that you operate. I can say from the position of facilitator, this was a question that came up already, whether being here in Berlin we ought to do this in German, or whether in what it meant to default to English as the language, as the kind of hegemonic one. So it's a question that exists, but I'm just very curious, I think for Nadia, how that plays a role in the decoloniale, and maybe also for Dirk or for Grace, if there are questions that come there.
Yeah, I mean, let me try it. Language is really crucial to my work and my practice as a curator. And it obviously language shapes our thinking and vice versa. It's very important. And that's why I'm trying to possibly have people be able to use their native or their first language, you know, because that's really important, and then provide translation. However, you know, others of our formats, we also adapt to circumstances like, you know, today. And it's also interesting to see how people utilize language. No, I wasn't sure whether you refer to language as, you know, tongues or the quality of language and certain concepts. And, you know, because I know you, Karina, so you think. Yes, and so language, for me, Actually, I was happy to see that one of the books I edited, Kerben des Kolonialismus, wie Rassismus aus Wörtern spricht, impossible to translate into English, I find is here in the bookstore. And that book deals, and it's a collection with like 40, 50 authors who contributed. Proud to say it has become somewhat of a classic, and that deals with certain concepts in language, like colonial concepts and also decolonial concepts in language and how we utilize language. And so that is, for me, obviously very crucial, you know. And just to finalize it, now we are being approached at Decoloniale also by, for example, art museums, and they are also getting more woke and more conscious about language, wording, you know, subtitling, naming, you know, when they're describing eras or works in their catalogs, and they're starting to become more and more aware that that is also something, you know, to be really conscious of and address. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, I mean, for me or for our work at World Inclusion, language is a huge topic. Also, when we talk about or talk with cultural institutions, I mean, I guess one of the many layers of language is how cultural institutions, how they announce their events or their exhibitions or their program, which wording they are using and what kind of knowledge they are like expecting from the reader to understand. I mean, many of these cultural institutions, they use a lot of terms that are not very well known in the general audience. So they are using terms that art critics understand, that art connoisseurs understand, but many of these texts are very complicated, and they are like within the art context and not very accessible for people who are not part of the group, so to say. That's one layer. But also one important thing is how cultural institutions talk about their audience. For example, it makes a huge difference if I say our museum has a guiding system for blind people, or if I say our museum has a guiding system which is tactile on the floor, and we don't care who is using it. You can use it when you're blind. Thanks. You can use it when you're blind, or you can use it when you're vision impaired, or you can use it if you're sighted, and because it has a color and it guides you somewhere. So instead of thinking about target groups, we should think about what we can offer and communicate what we can offer very clearly, very transparent, so people can decide if this event or this program is for me, and not the museum is telling us this is for blind people, this is for deaf people, this is for whatever, but they should clarify what they are offering, and people can decide on their own.
Thank you so much. I saw a question here in the front. Do you still... where is the speaker, the mic? Could somebody bring the mic up to here? There's somebody here in the front who had a question.
Hello, thank you for your wonderful speeches, and I do not have a questions, but rather a comment. I'm Eva-Kristina Harlin. I work in the Sami Museum, Sida, in up north, there in Finnish Samiland, and I totally agree with all of you, and I really, it made me think of my whole kind of career as an archaeologist from the beginning, and then moving towards maybe kind of archaeology done in another way, because I do a lot of I do a lot of work in the archives looking for background information for Sami objects or belongings, and I have a really nice experience working for 4 years now together with Sami contemporary artist Outi Pieski, and we have been searching or studying a type of Sami woman's hat called the Ladjokahpir, which contains a very strong narrative. And we have visited many museum collections in Europe and in Nordic countries, and then returned all this knowledge that we have found to the Sami woman whose heritage this is. And we have arranged workshops and had conversations there. And it has given me hope, because it shows what kind of power these belongings that come from the ancestors and are for the future generations, how they can be part of a healing process and also a part of empowerment. So, and this process we have decided to call rematriation, when the silent knowledge and all the riddles and all the tradition, the living tradition, the elders, the younger, come together and work with these objects and simultaneously use their hands and make the same movements their ancestors have been making for several hundreds of years. So this process that the museums of indigenous peoples that are finally, slowly but finally receiving back the belongings that have been stolen or taken away, more or less violently, they can have a huge impact on having discussions about difficult things like colonialization and its influences. For example, on the reciprocity between all beings and the kind of reciprocity between all genders and all beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the comment. Are there other questions, comments? Yes, I see one here.
Thank you also very much for these inputs and for the possibility to exchange. It was wonderful having this talk. And actually, I was talking with Naomi. My name is Mandu, and what resonated, because you asked about resonating, was we started with how to decolonize museums, but what resonated with us was the vision of museums as healing spots, as places of encounters where a lot of people can meet. And we also reflected about in many African traditions, culture and healing is very close. So art and healing is very close. Also, our question actually was, we could imagine that museums can be catalysts or laboratories for a new and healed society, but the question was how it will be possible, because it will be needed, that, as Grace told, for example, people are empowered to get on this place where different people from different contexts are unable to come to the place which is called museum. How is it possible to disconnect the image of museum from the intellectual side? It's not only intellectual, it's also our body, it's other things. And only, for example, here, to get here on this place with so many and wonderful people, many people don't know about it. Many people have the problem of the digital access or to get in here or money. And how is it possible to really make it change and participate, and also how to participate also in the curating, in the sense who decides what is in. So, but we could, yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Mandu. Great question. Grace, would you like to respond to that?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess in my work, I'm always trying to think about what we have in common as humans. So maybe looking at a bigger perspective, thinking about things like deep time and things like that. So in terms of language even, you know, like shamanism, animism is the first world religion, the first world spiritual thing that we all practiced on all continents, and we all use very similar symbols, you know, to do with the sun, to do with mountains, to do with hunting and gathering. So we have a lot in common in our genetics and in the way that we symbolize the world, which kind of makes me also think about this idea of commoning, of the commons. And my idea of when I think of the future of the museum is really to do with the issue of objects, is about this idea of maybe, and it might sound really far-fetched, but this idea of creating a global database which belongs to the people, which belongs to the public, where all objects can be shown in all places. So in Benin, if you want to show an object from the Sami, for example, there's this possibility. Or from the Sami, if they want to show, be able to see works from the Louvre in Paris, it's possible. That actually all the objects belong to all the people. That objects they don't belong to any state or any nation or any museum if they're in public institutions. So I think that's a key thing of thinking about in terms of circulating objects, because the key to also working with objects is energetically circulating the energy in the buildings. And so having other types of people and other types of energies come in. And for example, at the MOA in Vancouver, which we were just talking about before, where for, I don't know, about 15, 20 years ago, they started inviting First Nation groups into the storage in the museums and working with the objects, but also giving objects back to First Nations so they could take the objects back and use them in their communities in terms of rituals. To kind of re-energize certain objects. And I think this is important, this transfer and this exchange. And also the more that that's done, the more that people will feel more empowered to understand that museums belong to them. Thank you.
Go ahead, would you like to jump in, Nadia?
Yeah, I think the issue is that we have to do various things at the same time. It's sort of like parallel action. I can follow Grace, and I think that's also a beautiful approach. But there's something within me sitting here in Berlin in 2021 where I'm feeling that we are just at the very beginning of the conversation. 90% of African cultural heritage is abroad, is not on the continent. Very slowly there is a sense in the West that these artifacts don't belong to the West and should be returned. We're at the very beginning. We don't even know, most museums don't even know what they have in their archives, in their basements. It was a frenzy of collecting, colonial collecting, and we are holding in Germany bodies because Germany also, colonialism also meant racial signs. So we are holding, again, thousands, maybe 10,000 of human remains of cranes. And so I cannot get to the healing because I think my point is, okay, let's look, first of all, acknowledge and stay in that space of the magnitude of that project. And stay with that, really acknowledge and really understand what happened and what that means. Before we talk about healing, I mean, something else has to happen in terms of acknowledgement, you know, of the situation. Then I think we are always very fast of, okay, we have an idea, now let's try to fast, you know, get rid of that what is unpleasant, that which is violent, that which is really deeply traumatic. And it's too much of a rush. You know, that's why also even though I'm working for a project called Decoloniale, the term, the vocabulary of to decolonize is something that I'm really hesitant to even utilize in terms of vocabulary because it runs danger of becoming an empty shell, you know. And so I think sometimes we need to stay in that space of also being with what's so and what has been so for a long time.
I think this term acknowledgement is so powerful and important to sit with the discomfort as well. And it reminds me of the first piece of John Coltrane's A Love Supreme is acknowledgement, to stay with pain. But Grace.
Yes, I wanted to say, maybe I haven't been clear about what I mean by healing, because healing is not a nice, pleasant thing. It's a transformative process. So it's going to be cathartic. It's going to be painful. You know, you're giving birth to a new self. We're trying to rebirth these museums, you know, birth to our, you know, society. So it's not going to be like all pleasant and kumbaya. So yeah, there's different stages to healing, aren't there? And so we're in one particular stage, but it's really important that we don't just get stuck in trauma, you know, because we're already talking about trauma, traumatized peoples, you know, and people have already been carrying a trauma. So you have to go past the trauma to get to the next stage. And I think we're in that process of trying to, you know, rebirth ourselves. And so it's painful and it's awkward and it's difficult. But yeah, I think, you know, we have to go through this. Otherwise, we're just going to be stuck in this very heavy energy. And yeah, to continue to be, I don't want to be having this conversation in 100 years or 500 years or whatever. You know, we shouldn't be stuck there. We have to go past it.
No, I do agree. We cannot ever get stuck in trauma, absolutely. But we have just only begun to uncover the trauma. And this is nothing that we can do away with. Fast, fast, fast. I'm not the person to get stuck in anything, I think. But what I think is what I want, or what I ask of the institutions in the West. I mean, Africans and other, you know, folks from the Global South are already engaging in ways to think up spaces where the restituted items, if restitution happens, you know, will be held and, you know, to reinvent or invent the idea of the museum. What I'm asking of institutions, our institutions in the West, is to also do their homework, so not to just consume what indigenous folks, what critical thinkers, what you know, thinkers of African descent or artists of African descent bring to the table. It's another way to consume something. That's the danger, and of just covering up responsibility. You know, looking over there. And I want people that inhabit these institutions and these discourses and have the privilege not to have these hurdles and, you know, difficulties of access, to really sit down on their behinds and not look over there and consume, but be like, okay, I inhabit these institutions, I inhabit these structures of thought. Let me think about, out of this privilege and out of this collective also understanding of self, how to transform these institutions, how to really change them. And that is the danger I'm seeing, is just to, again, consume. That's, you know, the way we are sitting here, you know, a woman of African descent, British, Kenyan descent, Prem, you know, and Dirk and myself, and then, you know, to be consumed. What we are thinking, what we are feeling, what we are presenting, and that being fed into this machine. So I'm just really, I'm just saying, I'm a bit guarded about that, and I need people to do their homework.
Thank you. I think that's a powerful statement.
We have very little time. Do you want a short? We're already over time. So do you want to say something, Dirk? I saw you pick up your mic for a very short statement. Then we have to say.
Yeah, no, maybe just to add, I guess this notion of healing can be one step in the process, but it should be like combined with political actions and political decisions. And I guess the danger that I see is that at least in Germany, there's not enough political bravery and not enough political decision making that is connected to these processes of opening the museum and opening for new audience, etc. So it's always, if the cultural institutions, if they want to, they are doing it, but it's not really enough pressure from outside, as far as I can tell.
Thank you, Dirk. And do you want to make a final statement?
Just a final thought. Carrying on from what Nadia was saying is, that's also the danger with the term healing, you know, that it becomes, you know, just a form of spiritual materialism, you know, and we're on a tipping point of that happening within institutions and the art world because of market forces. So, yeah, I think we've got to keep our eyes open.
I agree, and I think that what's become clear is that this is a start. This is even just a tiny scratching of the surface of the work that needs to be done. But there are several more days of conversation here. I want to say what a privilege it has been to share the stage with all of you and to learn with you, from you, in conversation with you. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists. And I also want to thank all of you for being here, because this is the first step. The question is, what happens next? But thank you for being here, witnessing and participating in it.